Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Well, attacks on the Syrian province of Idlib continue. The province is technically a demilitarized zone. However, around 3 million people that have been living there are under attack currently by the Syrian regime as well as Russian forces. This according to reports that we've been receiving here at Indus News over the past week or so. Now, this, of course, comes after Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is dominated by members of a former al-Qaeda affiliate, have not been holding on to their end of the bargain and have not vacated areas that they were supposed to, hence leading to these attacks in Idlib at this time. On top of that, there is also the Iranian role in Syria. What is the Iranian role going forward, considering its tug of war now with Russia over issues such as reconstruction and over Israeli interests as well as Turkish interests as well? All right, so Hadi, I wanted to get your thoughts then on what's in Syria from the Iranian point of view, because the Iranians have also obviously been involved in Syria for a while now. What do you make of Iran's stances in Syria, even when it comes to, for example, areas such as Idlib in that country?
First off, we have to consider the fact that on the ground, at least, Iranian factions in Syria are not very active right now in the northwestern front in Syria. And I actually think that it's the current Idlib operation that is happening is mostly so they can actually move away the HTS and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham group from the demilitarized zone, because they have been attacking the Hmeimim base, the Russian air base in Syria for a long time now. And the thing is, Iran actually prefers, like Russia, to have the Idlib also retaken. I'm not going to go into details how difficult and how and the repercussions that will create, but I don't really see how this actual operation is connected to Iran. It's mostly about Russia, in my opinion.
Okay, so then is that a sign then, Hadi, of the limits of Iranian influence in Syria? Because, you know, there is seemingly, Hadi, at least now, a growing conversation about a possible tug of war between Iran and Russia. Is there any comparison, do you think, Hadi, between Iran's involvement in Syria and Russian involvement in Syria?
Actually, yeah, because you have to consider that Russia doesn't share like all the objectives that Iran does, and Iran doesn't. It's not the same for Iran either in Syria. Yeah. First off, the Russians have been, they have, let's say, in regards to the Iranian presence in the Golan or near the Golan and near Israel, they have been on the Israeli side, and they haven't really tried to do anything to stop Israel from attacking the Iranian forces. And also on the economic side, Russia actually has invested heavily, I think more than Iran, on the Syria campaign. And I think they are more aggressive in trying to secure the economic, let's say, prizes that Syria could have for them right now for the reconstruction process in Syria. There will be conflict. There is a conflict of interest. It's going to just get worse from now on.
Heiko, what do you make of that tug of war then between Russia and Iran? You know, Iran would argue at its end, I'm sure, that it has sacrificed a lot to keep Assad in power and to support the fight, quote unquote, against terrorism. Iran has even provided more than $7 billion in credits to Syria since the war erupted, essentially saving Assad from financial ruin. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not so sure how much credit I want to give to that idea of a tug of war. I mean there are different interests. That's true, and my colleague in Tehran has mentioned the Golan, mentioned Israel. Of course, I mean that's very clear. There is, on the other hand, a clear overlap of interest. So both Iran and Russia have invested heavily in Syria, treasure and lives as well. So and I don't think any of them would want that investment to just go for naught. And I don't think any one of them would would jeopardize that investment by getting into a fight with the other. I mean, as long as the overall crisis isn't resolved, both want to rehabilitate, to re-legitimize the Assad regime. That's quite clear. So I suspect, or I believe, with all the differences that may exist, the overlap is still large. The shared interest, and let's not forget, Iran is beleaguered. Iran is really needs friends at this point in time. Yeah. It would be pretty foolish to gamble with that.
Okay, so let's add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined by Mr. Flores, who is a director. He's the director, for the Center for Syncretic Studies. He's the editor-in-chief also for Forward Russ News. He's joining us now from Belgrade. Joaquin, thanks for joining us here in Scope. Joaquin, do you think that there is a tug-of-war between Russia and Iran when it comes to their specific interests in Syria? The estimates for reconstruction, for example, in that country run upwards of $350 billion, according to some estimates. That's a lot of money.
It is a lot of money. I know that there is a tug-of-war narrative that we find across media and of course across professional analysis of these events. I think that the total cost of the war should also be understood in terms of the human cost. There have been hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed. There have been many millions internally displaced. There have been countless tens and hundreds of thousands of soldiers as well who have laid their lives on the line and have sacrificed to keep Syria as an integral and whole country under a legitimate government that is still recognized by the UN and has legitimacy in the eyes of the international community by and large, and by countries which represent the majority of the world's population. And so I think that speaking in terms of a tug of war is not splitting hairs, of course, but it's perhaps missing the point that many of these countries involved in this conflict now on what is increasingly and apparently the victorious side, if we can call it such, are interested in a growing multipolarity and actually integrating these economies and in fact, looking at development projects in terms of win-win. And so I think that the tug-of-war narrative is a little bit looking at things in terms of what's known as positional bargaining. And I think that that positional bargaining, of course, at times rears its head. And positional bargaining, of course, at times can be the undergirding of the finer points of detail. But what we're looking at, by and large, of course, is a larger development program to build superhighways that would connect the global economy as it is emerging via land routes. And these would go through Iraq and through Syria. And
okay,
so it only requires...
if I may interrupt you for a moment, Joaquin, because I wanted to put this in the middle of all this. The Israel factor is an important one, isn't it? Because it does seem like Russia respects, to an extent, if I may use that term, Israel's interests vis-a-vis Syria and vis-a-vis Israel's concerns over Iran being too close to what Israel would see as its borders. That's certainly a very important factor in that perceived tug-of-war, isn't it?
Well, certainly, Israel is a country that exists in the region, and they have their own interests as well, and they have significant influence upon a number of governments in the world. And so the question arises is, does Israel have a seat at the table? Yes, they do. And then the question arises as at which table will they sit? And so if one were to begin with an a priori position that Israel cannot speak, or Israel has nothing at all, has no position at all to recognize, then that only places them with the alternative of turning to the United States to reinforce their position. And I think that the history of the last 2 decades in this region has shown that all of the United States moves have been quite disastrous and have been against stability and against economic and social growth in all spheres. And so if Russia is acting as a moderating factor on Israel's otherwise behavior, then I think that might be a positive thing.
Very interesting point of view there, Joaquin. Let me put that to Hadi in Tehran. Hadi, do you agree with Joaquin's point of view there? Do you think Iran sees Russia as somebody who is mediating in some ways the Israeli interests when it comes to Syria? Because it seems like, according to some estimates, again, Hadi, and I could be wrong on this, you can correct me, but it seems that Russia has given free hand to Israel to attack Iranian interests in Syria. Do you agree with that, Hadi?
Actually, there has been some. If you look at the history of the Israeli attacks in Syria, I don't really remember the exact number, but it was over 100, more than that. I don't remember exactly the amount of times, the amount of airstrikes that Israel has carried on Iranian targets in Syria. All the while that Russian forces have been present in those same areas and have decided to look the other way. And that's actually giving a green light to, that's actually going more to the Israeli side of the spectrum from the Russian side than actually the Iranian side. There has been talks here in Iran, and there have been complaints from Iranian officials, mostly military, and the IRGC about this, this Russian stance in Syria, because they have given free hand to Israel, and not once they have tried to stop them. It doesn't really seem to me that, at least from the Iranian viewpoint, that they are mediating or, confronting the Israelis, and not confronting, but at least asking them not to attack or refrain from attacking, because that doesn't seem the case.
Heiko, what are your thoughts on, what do you make of the Israel factor in the middle of all this?
Well, I mean, you should ask the Israelis directly what they want in Syria. But if we want to make a guess, I would think they would really like to go back to pre-2011, have a stable authoritarian regime that thinks better of making trouble at the border and tries to bring in investment and to build its own oligarchic interests there. So and Iran, or from the Iranian perspective, I think the interesting part is to actually use Syria, as they're using Lebanon, as a card of deterrence. So Israel can attack Iran. Israel has the means to attack Iran with missiles, with air force. The Israelis, of course, don't want to do that. They prefer that the Americans do that, but the option does exist. The Iranians don't have these means themselves, but they can do it to their allies and proxies from Lebanon. And I think they wouldn't mind having that same option in Syria. It's useful to have two theaters, Lebanon and Syria, with different rules, so you can play different games. So from the Iranian perspective, that's all advantages and assets in the current confrontation, and they are in with the U.S. and they believe, I think, accurately that the U.S. and Israel at this point in time pretty much the same thing, or the two sides of the same coin. And this is clearly not in the interest of the Russians. The Russians also would like to go back to the pre-2011 situation. And you go to Moscow, you hear that. They're very nostalgic about the old times, the old dictators that would do as they were told, that were reliable, that were rational, and all of this. Not sure, but I'm not sure there is a way back there, really.
Joaquin, I wonder what you make of foreign ministers' visit. The Iranian foreign minister visited Moscow. Obviously, most of those talks, at least public statements, were mostly, of course, about the nuclear deal itself and Iran's warning and deadline for 60 days. The Russians placing the blame squarely back on the Americans. But I wonder, while the Russians and Iranians do agree when it comes to the nuclear deal, these other areas, such as Syria, can really muddy the waters, can't they?
I think they can. When I look at the events in Syria and who had an interest in a stable Syria, I don't include Israel in that list of countries that looks back fondly on the pre-2011 days. In fact, I wonder and I question the integrity and thoughtfulness of such claims, which really, I think, fly in the face of reason, the historical record, the open and admitted support that that Israel has given, both medical and supplies, to the most radicalized elements fighting actually Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, and ISIS units, which the Israeli medical teams have evacuated, have supported, have supplied. And this is entirely contrary to any narrative that Israel would prefer the government of Assad. And I think that this regime discourse is also very toxic because all of these countries are recognized at the level of the UN, making them not regimes, but governments, which are duly respected and exist within the accordance of international law. So now I think that in terms of muddying the waters on Syria, every country involved in this conflict, of course, is operating along the lines of its own national interests, which it's seeking to forge. And of course, at times, these alliances appear to be shifting, or they can shift if one actor begins to behave in a way that is either predictable or unpredictably unstable. So I think that really the X factor in this conflict so far has been that Israel is triangulating in a very serious and successful way to a large extent, but I don't think that fundamentally Iran and Russia have conflicting aims in Syria. It's really a question of letting and allowing Israeli leadership to save face and to not feel, and so that investors and military and other connected consortia can feel that they're safe in the hands of a Russian mediating force.
All right, I believe has gotten the best of us. We're going to leave it there at as our final word. That was Joaquin Flores, director of the Center for Syncretic Studies, also editor-in-chief at Fort Russ News. He was speaking to us from Belgrade. We were also joined by Mr. Hadi Gholami, who is a political analyst. He was speaking to us from the Iranian capital, Tehran. And finally, we were joined by Mr. Heiko Wimmen, who is with the International Crisis Group. He is their project director for Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. He was speaking to us from the Lebanese capital. Now, viewers, as all three of our guests spoke about, this tug-of-war narrative between Russia and Iran, it may very well be overstated. However, their conflicting interests, or their different interests, more accurately, are now coming to the fore ever more so now in these coming days, considering, of course, Russia does stand by Israel more, of course, than Iran would ever, and yet the Russians standing by Iran when it comes to the nuclear deal. So this is a bit of a maze, a bit of myriad of conflicting interests and different different players, external players there in Syria. And we haven't even spoken about Turkey yet amongst all of this. We'll keep a close eye on how that situation develops, as well as, of course, the situation in Idlib, which remains at this point in time a major unresolved issue in Syria. I'll be back with our next segment after this short break.